The sound of splintering wood rang out in the small living room, sharp and shocking, followed by a wave of pain that shot through my right shoulder and down my arm. For a split second, I could not process what had just happened. My breath caught in my throat, and my eyes darted to the source. My sister Sophie stood over me, still gripping the edge of the wooden chair she had just swung at me with both hands. Her face was flushed, her eyes burning with a strange mix of satisfaction and rage. I could smell the faint scent of the lemon polish our mother used on the furniture, mixed now with the musty, splintered wood where the chair's leg had cracked on impact. My legs gave way and I dropped to my knees, my palm instinctively flying to my shoulder, feeling the throbbing heat that pulsed under my skin. A dull roar filled my ears as the room around me swayed slightly. Sophie was still there looming, her mouth curled in a smirk that told me she thought she had won something, though I had no idea what. Our parents were in the room. I remember glancing toward the couch, expecting at least one of them to rush to me to check if I was hurt, to ask what had happened. They didn't move. My father leaned back in his recliner, his hands folded loosely in his lap, his eyes on me, but without urgency. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line before she spoke in a calm, almost bored voice. "It's just sibling fights." The words landed harder than the chair. I blinked at her, my mouth opening, but no sound coming out. Sibling fights. As though Sophie swinging a solid oak chair at me was no different from a playful shove. As though the searing pain spreading from my shoulder was a normal part of growing up. The living room was bathed in the soft yellow glow from the overhead light, casting gentle shadows that felt absurdly at odds with the tension hanging in the air. The TV in the corner was still on volume low, a game show host's cheerful banter filling the silence between us like some twisted soundtrack. Sophie straightened her posture casually, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I could feel her gaze on me, taunting without words. My shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, and I was suddenly aware of how shallow my breathing had become. The cold from the hardwood floor seeped through the knees of my jeans, and I wanted to get up to put some space between myself and her, but my body refused to cooperate. My mother turned her head toward my father as though waiting for him to add something. He finally spoke, his voice even but dismissive. "Don't exaggerate, Emily. You're fine." Fine. My mind scrambled to connect the dots between the reality I was living and the version they were insisting was true. My right arm was tingling in a way that made me nervous, like pins and needles that wouldn't fade. I thought about the interview I had scheduled in 2 days for the university scholarship, the one I had been preparing for over a year. The idea of showing up with a bruised shoulder and barely able to move my arm made my stomach twist. I pushed myself up slowly, using my left arm for support, and Sophie stepped back, giving me space not out of concern, but to watch what I would do. I did not give her the reaction she wanted. I did not yell or cry or demand an apology. I simply stood there, breathing through my teeth, looking at both of my parents, searching for some flicker of recognition that what had just happened was wrong. There was nothing. My father reached for the remote and turned the volume up slightly. My mother picked up her knitting from the side table and began looping yarn as if nothing had happened. Sophie sat down on the couch, crossing one leg over the other, her expression calm now, like she had settled into victory. I wrapped my arms around myself, careful to keep pressure off my shoulder, and took a slow step toward the hallway. Each step sent a small jolt of pain through my upper body. I could feel Sophie's eyes following me, but I did not look back. In my room, the door clicked shut behind me, and I leaned against it, letting my head fall back against the wood. My mind replayed the moment of impact, over and over, the sound, the smell, the look on her face. But louder than all of that was my mother's voice. "It's just sibling fights." I knew deep down that this was not just a bad evening or a single argument gone too far. This was a sign, maybe the clearest one yet, that if I stayed here, I would always be in danger, and no one would ever step in to help me. The next morning, the pain in my shoulder had settled into a deep ache that flared each time I tried to lift my arm. I sat at my desk, the glow of my laptop screen lighting up the otherwise dim room, scrolling through the notes I had prepared for my scholarship interview. It was set for 2 days from now, a final step in the process that could secure me a full ride to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. I had been working toward this for years, pouring every spare moment into my grades, my extracurriculars, my essays. This scholarship was more than just money for tuition. It was my ticket out of this house, out of the small town where my parents' version of reality was the only one that mattered. If I failed the interview, it would mean staying here for another year, maybe more, and that thought made my stomach tighten with dread. I could picture the future so clearly. Sophie continuing to undermine me at every turn, my parents brushing off every incident as harmless sibling rivalry, the cycle repeating, until I either gave in or broke completely. The physical injury was bad enough, but the real danger was psychological. Every time my parents minimized what happened, it chipped away at my confidence, made me question whether my perspective could even be trusted. I thought about the way my mother's voice had been so calm when she dismissed the chair incident, as though she had rehearsed that line for years. My father's refusal to even look concerned told me everything about where his loyalties lay. The more I replayed it, the more I understood that their lack of reaction was not a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate choice. If I showed up to that interview looking weak or distracted, it could be enough for the panel to pass me over. They were looking for someone poised, focused, resilient. I could manage resilience. I had been managing it for years, but poised, focused. That was harder to fake when the people who were supposed to care about me were the ones I needed to protect myself from. The stakes were not just about getting into college. They were about survival. In this house, any achievement of mine was a threat to Sophie's position as the favored child, and she reacted accordingly. My parents enabled it, whether out of denial, laziness, or some twisted sense of keeping the peace. Staying meant living under constant threat, never knowing what form the next attack would take. Leaving meant freedom, but only if I could make it happen without their help. I glanced at my reflection in the darkened window, my face pale, my eyes ringed with shadows from a night of restless sleep. If the interview panel saw this version of me, would they believe I could handle the pressure of their program? I knew I had to hide the injury to carry myself as though nothing was wrong. That was the cruel irony. In order to escape the people who hurt me, I had to pretend they didn't. The pain in my shoulder was a constant reminder of what was at stake. If I let it slow me down, if I let them see it had affected me, I would be giving them exactly what they wanted. I had 2 days to get through without triggering another incident, to keep Sophie from finding some new way to sabotage me, to keep my parents from finding an excuse to side with her again. 2 days to keep my composure until I could secure a future where none of them had this kind of power over me. Failure was not an option. This was not just about a scholarship anymore. It was about proving, if only to myself, that they couldn't keep me here forever. Our family lived in a modest 2-story house on the edge of a small Midwestern town, where everyone seemed to know each other's business, or at least thought they did. From the outside, we were a picture-perfect family. My father worked as the assistant branch manager of the local bank. My mother was a librarian at the elementary school. And my sister Sophie was the kind of person people described as magnetic. She had the looks, the confidence, the easy charm that made her the center of every room she walked into. She was captain of the cheerleading squad homecoming queen and had a circle of friends who treated her like royalty. Our parents adored her, and it was not the subtle kind of favoritism that people sometimes try to hide. It was open, obvious, and constant. Sophie's achievements were celebrated loudly and publicly, from her sports trophies to her roles in school plays. Her photographs covered the walls of our living room, framed and lit by small picture lights. My own accomplishments, though often more academic than social, were acknowledged with a nod or a short sentence before the conversation shifted back to Sophie. I learned early that my victories were not family victories. They were tolerated at best. As far back as I could remember, Sophie had been allowed to get away with things that would have gotten me grounded for weeks. When I was 6, she accidentally spilled juice all over a diorama I had made for a science fair. My mother said she didn't mean it, and reminded me that I should not have left it on the table. When I was 12, she told my best friend that I had been talking behind her back, which ended the friendship in a single afternoon. My father told me it was a lesson about being careful whom I trusted. When I was 15, after saving for months to buy a dress for the spring dance, I found it shredded in the trash the day before the event. My mother suggested maybe I had left it somewhere it could have been damaged. There was never any real investigation. Never any consequences for Sophie. The pattern was clear. Sophie acted, I absorbed the damage, my parents dismissed it. Over time, I became quieter, more withdrawn, choosing books and schoolwork over parties and social drama. I told myself it was better that way, that avoiding Sophie meant avoiding conflict. But the truth was that she always found a way to pull me back into her orbit when it suited her. Sometimes it was through small acts of sabotage, a hidden homework folder, a mysteriously broken phone charger, and other times it was direct confrontation. Our parents' strategy was always the same: minimize, excuse, redirect. They like to call it keeping the peace, but in reality, it was about keeping Sophie happy. Their need to protect her image was so strong that it overrode their duty to protect me. The control was subtle but suffocating. Decisions about my life were often made without me justified as being for the good of the family. If I questioned them, I was told I was being ungrateful. They believed that family loyalty meant silence about what happened inside our home. Any sign of defiance on my part was labeled disrespect. Over the years, I internalized that speaking up would only make things worse. Still, there were moments when I could not help but notice how calculated Sophie's cruelty could be. She had a way of picking her moments always when my parents were nearby, but just far enough to pretend they had not seen or heard the worst of it. It gave them the plausible deniability they seemed to crave. The older we got, the more her behavior escalated. By the time I was a senior in high school, I understood that Sophie saw me not just as a sibling, but as competition. Every award I won, every teacher who praised me, every inch of progress I made toward a future outside our small town seemed to ignite something in her. I did not need to guess why. Sophie's world was built on being the star, and my achievements threatened the narrative my parents had so carefully crafted. They had invested in her identity as the golden child, and in their eyes, my successes were disruptive. In public, they would smile and say how proud they were of both their daughters, but in private, the hierarchy was enforced with quiet discipline. I learned to read the signs. A sharp look from my mother across the dinner table meant I was talking too much about something that happened at school. My father's tight jaw meant I should not press an issue. Sophie's thin smile, almost imperceptible to outsiders, meant she had already decided how she was going to put me back in my place. By the time of the chair incident, I had endured years of these dynamics. I was used to the small betrayals, the casual cruelty, the way my parents' love seemed conditional on my ability to stay invisible. But that night made something clear. Their favoritism was not just emotional neglect. It was a shield that allowed Sophie to harm me without consequence. In that moment, with my shoulder throbbing and my mother's words echoing in my ears, I understood that nothing I could do, no achievement, no perfect behavior, would change the way this family worked. The rules were fixed, and they had been written long before I was old enough to understand them. That realization was the beginning of the end for me. The tension between Sophie and me had been simmering for weeks before the night she hit me with the chair, and it all came to a boil the moment I was announced as a finalist for the prestigious Horizon Scholars Program. The program was highly competitive, with only a handful of students from across the state chosen each year. Winning it meant not just a full scholarship, but also a stipend for living expenses and guaranteed internships. When the letter arrived, I opened it at the kitchen table, my hands trembling with excitement. Sophie was across from me scrolling through her phone, and when I read the words aloud, her head snapped up. The smile she gave me was thin and brittle. "Congratulations," she said, her voice flat. Later that night, I overheard her on the phone with a friend dismissing my achievement as a nerd award and saying it wouldn't mean anything in the real world. At first, I told myself to ignore it, to keep my focus on preparing for the final interview. But Sophie seemed determined to make her presence felt. She would turn the TV up loud while I was trying to study, leave my bedroom door wide open when I had it closed for quiet, or accidentally borrow my pens and notebooks without returning them. These were small annoyances, but they chipped away at my concentration. Then came the laptop incident. 3 days before my interview, Sophie knocked on my door and asked to borrow my laptop for a school project. I told her I couldn't because I needed it for my prep work and because my files were already organized for the interview. Her expression shifted from mock sweetness to cold anger in an instant. "You think you're better than me now," she said, her voice low and sharp. Before I could respond, she slammed my door so hard that a picture frame on the wall rattled and fell to the floor. At dinner that evening, she complained to our parents that I was being selfish and refusing to help her. My father gave me a disapproving look, and my mother said, "You need to be more accommodating, Emily. It's just a laptop." I tried to explain that my interview was too important to risk anything happening to my materials, but it was clear they had already taken Sophie's side. The next day, she found new ways to interfere. When I went to the kitchen to make tea, she had taken the last tea bags and hidden them. She unplugged the Wi-Fi router twice while I was working, claiming it was an accident. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to not give her the reaction she wanted. But inside, I could feel the frustration building. It wasn't just about the laptop or the tea or the Wi-Fi. It was about the message she kept sending. No matter what I achieved, she could still control my environment. On the evening before the interview, we were all at the dinner table. My shoulder was still sore from the constant tension of the week, but I had managed to finalize my notes. I was determined to get through the night without conflict, but Sophie had other plans. She started with small digs, commenting on my outfit, questioning whether I was ready for the interview, suggesting I would choke under pressure. My parents chuckled at her remarks, as though they were harmless jokes. I stayed quiet, focusing on my food, until she reached over and plucked the fork from my hand, laughing when I glared at her. "Give it back," I said quietly, but she leaned back in her chair and waved it just out of reach. My father told me not to make a scene. I took a breath, deciding to let it go, and stood to clear my plate. That was when I heard the scrape of a chair leg against the floor, fast and loud. I turned just in time to see Sophie gripping the back of her wooden chair with both hands, swinging it toward me in one swift motion. The impact knocked me sideways, pain radiating through my upper arm and shoulder. I stumbled against the wall, gasping. My mother's voice came from somewhere behind me, calm and detached. "It's just sibling fights." My father's voice followed, "Don't exaggerate." I stared at them, stunned, the world narrowing to the throbbing in my shoulder and the hollow pit opening in my chest. This wasn't an argument anymore. This was escalation. The night after Sophie hit me with the chair, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my shoulder a constant dull throb. Every time I shifted, pain flared, and I had to bite back a hiss so my parents wouldn't accuse me of being dramatic. I replayed the moment in my head, the way Sophie's grip tightened on the chair, the split second before it connected, the smirk on her face when she saw me stagger. More than the physical pain, it was the certainty in her eyes that unsettled me. She knew she would get away with it. She always did. The next morning, my arm felt stiff and weak. I tried to hide the injury under a loose sweater, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of seeing me struggle. I also knew that showing weakness in front of my parents would only lead to more dismissals and lectures about keeping the peace. But the timing couldn't have been worse. My scholarship interview was that afternoon, and I needed to be sharp. I arrived at school early, hoping to print some last-minute notes and review in the library. While I was walking down the hallway, Coach Reynolds spotted me. She was one of the few teachers who seemed to notice when something wasn't right. She called my name, and when I turned, her eyes went straight to the way I was holding my arm. "What happened?" she asked. I told her I had strained it lifting something heavy, but she didn't look convinced. She asked if she could see it, and before I could object, she gently pushed up my sleeve. The bruising was already deep purple, spreading from my shoulder down to my upper arm in ugly patches. Her face tightened. "That's not from lifting something heavy." She didn't press for details, just told me to follow her to the nurse's office. Mrs. Hanley, the school nurse, examined my arm and confirmed what I already knew: it was a blunt force injury. She asked me directly how it happened, and the lie came automatically. I tripped and fell into a table. But my hesitation must have given me away. Mrs. Hanley and Coach exchanged a look, and Coach said quietly, "Emily, you know we're here to help you, right?" I nodded, but stayed silent. Part of me wanted to tell them everything, but another part was terrified of what would happen if I did. After the exam, Mrs. Hanley insisted on documenting the injury with photos for the school's records. I sat there feeling exposed, the click of the camera sounding like a countdown to something I wasn't ready for. By the time I made it to the interview room that afternoon, I was exhausted. The panel greeted me warmly, and for the next 30 minutes, I forced myself to push the pain aside and focus on the questions. I smiled, I maintained eye contact, and I spoke with the confidence I had been rehearsing for months. When it was over, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I had managed to keep Sophie from winning this time, but that hope was short-lived. As I was leaving the building, I saw Sophie leaning against the hood of our father's car waiting. She didn't say a word as I approached, just smirked and muttered, "Hope you didn't embarrass us in there." On the drive home, my parents were unusually quiet. When we pulled into the driveway, my father turned to me and said, "We need to talk." Inside, they sat me down at the kitchen table. My mother folded her hands and told me they'd gotten a call from the school. Mrs. Hanley had reported my injury to Child Protective Services. I froze, my mind racing. My father's voice was calm but laced with warning. "We told them it was an accident, but you need to make sure you say the same thing. If you make this into something it's not, it will ruin this family." That phrase, "ruin this family," echoed in my head. I realized then that they weren't concerned about me at all. They were concerned about appearances, about keeping Sophie's record spotless, about avoiding any hint of scandal in our tight-knit town. That evening, 2 CPS workers showed up at our door with a local police officer. My mother greeted them with a tight smile, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. But when they asked to speak with me alone, my parents' expression shifted from politeness to barely concealed anger. In the dining room, the CPS worker asked me gently to explain what happened. For a moment, I considered lying to protect my parents' version of events. But then I remembered the way Sophie's face had looked when she swung that chair, the way my parents had sat there and done nothing, and the way my father had just told me to lie for them. So I told the truth. I told them about the chair, about the weeks of smaller incidents, about years of favoritism and dismissals. I told them about the scholarship and how every achievement of mine seemed to provoke Sophie's need to tear me down. By the time I finished, the CPS worker's expression had hardened. She told me what happened was not normal sibling behavior. It was abuse, and my parents had failed to protect me. She said they would be taking steps to ensure my safety starting immediately. When we stepped back into the living room, my mother's face was pale, but her eyes were sharp with fury. Sophie sat frozen on the couch, her hands clenched in her lap. My father opened his mouth to protest, but the police officer cut him off, explaining that I would be leaving with CPS for a temporary placement. As I walked out the door with my small backpack slung over my good shoulder, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear of what would come next, but relief that for the first time in years, Sophie and my parents wouldn't be able to touch me. The CPS car pulled away from my house, the headlights cutting through the early winter darkness. I sat in the back seat, my backpack resting against my legs, my injured shoulder throbbing with every bump in the road. Beside me, Officer Davis sat quietly, his presence solid but not intrusive. In the front, Mrs. Hill from CPS spoke into her phone, giving updates to someone at the office. She glanced back at me once, offering a small, reassuring smile. "We're taking you to a relative's house," she said, "your Aunt Martha." I vaguely remembered her from a few holidays years ago, my mother's younger sister who had stopped visiting without explanation. We turned onto a quiet street lined with modest houses, the kind where neighbors knew each other by name. Martha's house was small but warm light spilling from the windows onto the snow-dusted lawn. She opened the door before we could knock, her expression a mix of concern and resolve. "Emily," she said softly, pulling me into a hug. "It's okay. You're safe here." Inside, the smell of something baking filled the air, and the heat from the wood stove seeped into my chilled skin. Mrs. Hill explained the situation briefly while I sat at the kitchen table feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. Martha listened without interrupting, her gaze steady on me. When they were done, she promised she'd make sure I had my own room, my own space, and that no one would hurt me here. That first night, I lay in the guest room under a thick quilt, the unfamiliar quiet almost unsettling. No footsteps in the hall, no slammed doors, no mocking laughter drifting from the next room. Just the hum of the furnace and the occasional creak of the house settling. The next morning, Mrs. Hill returned with paperwork and a plan. CPS was opening a formal case against my parents for neglect and failure to protect. Sophie would be required to attend counseling, and my parents would have to complete parenting classes. I asked if I would have to go back, and she told me not unless a judge decided it was safe, which, given the evidence, was unlikely for now. Later that week, Coach Reynolds came by to drop off my school assignments. She brought a bag of groceries and a new set of pens and notebooks, saying she knew I'd need them to keep up with my work. Her kindness caught me off guard, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of something like hope. Martha began sharing bits of her own history with my mother, how she had left town years ago because of the same controlling behavior I had experienced. Hearing her say it out loud validated something I had been afraid to name. It wasn't just me. This was a pattern. Meanwhile, the outside forces working in my favor were gathering momentum. CPS documented my injuries thoroughly. The school provided statements about Sophie's past behavior toward me. Even neighbors who had seen small incidents over the years came forward to give testimony. The picture they painted was clear. This wasn't sibling rivalry. It was targeted harm enabled by parents who refused to intervene. As the case moved forward, I realized how much my world was shifting. The people who had always been bystanders were now becoming my allies. Teachers checked in on me, classmates who had once stayed silent now offered quiet words of encouragement. And through it all, Martha gave me the stability I had never known at home. She set a place for me at the table every night, asked about my day without judgment, and never once made me feel like a burden. The outside forces, CPS, the school, Martha, were not just protecting me. They were showing me what it felt like to have people on my side. And that was something Sophie and my parents could never take away again. Living with Martha gave me something I hadn't had in years: room to think. The constant tension that had been my normal at home was gone, replaced by quiet evenings, steady routines, and conversations that didn't feel like traps. That space made it possible for me to focus on the one thing I had left from my old life that mattered: the Horizon Scholars Program. A week after moving in, I got the email I had been waiting for. I had passed the final interview and been awarded the scholarship. Reading those words, I felt a surge of triumph so strong it made my hands shake. I wasn't just getting out of that house, I was getting out on my own terms. That night, Martha made a celebratory dinner, and Coach Reynolds stopped by with a cake. It wasn't a big crowd, but it was the first time in years I felt like people were genuinely happy for me without an agenda. And that was when I decided that my success would be my answer to everything Sophie and my parents had done. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need revenge, in the traditional sense. I would win by building a life so far beyond their control that they couldn't touch me. But that didn't mean I was done being passive. The CPS case was still open, and I had a chance to make sure the truth was fully documented. Over the next few weeks, I began compiling everything I could: photos of my injuries, copies of emails from teachers noting incidents, even text messages from Sophie that dripped with hostility. Martha helped me organize it all into a binder, labeling each section with dates and summaries. When Mrs. Hill came by for a check-in, I handed it to her without a word. She flipped through the pages, slowly nodding. "This is thorough, Emily," she said. "It will make a difference." Meanwhile, at school, I stopped avoiding the topic. When classmates asked why I was living with my aunt, I told them plainly, but without drama, that CPS had removed me from my home because of abuse. The reactions varied, some shocked, some sympathetic, but word traveled fast. The more people knew, the less power Sophie had to spin her own version. At first, she tried. She sent me texts accusing me of ruining her life, claiming I was jealous, calling me a liar. I didn't respond. Silence, I realized, was its own kind of weapon. Without my engagement, her words just hung there, impotent. My parents tried a different tactic. They sent long emails full of carefully chosen phrases about misunderstandings and wanting to work through this as a family. I replied with short, polite responses that gave nothing away. The truth was, I had no intention of going back, not physically, not emotionally. Every achievement from that point forward became part of my counterattack. I accepted an invitation to speak at a school assembly about perseverance and self-advocacy, deliberately framing my speech around standing up even when your voice shakes. I joined an early summer program for incoming scholarship students, which meant I could move onto campus months before the fall semester started. The more visible my progress became, the more I heard from people back home that Sophie was struggling. She had been pulled from cheerleading temporarily due to the counseling requirement, and her friends had started to drift away. My parents' reputations in the community had taken a hit as well. None of this brought me joy in the petty sense. It was more a quiet satisfaction in knowing the truth had consequences, even if I wasn't the one delivering the blows. My real focus was forward. I poured myself into preparing for college, connecting with professors in my program, and securing a spot in a competitive internship that would start the following year. Each step was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the toxic home I had escaped. When Mrs. Hill updated me on this case, telling me the judge was leaning toward long-term placement with Martha. Until I turned 18, I felt the last bit of anxiety about being forced to return start to fade. I had done it. Not just survived, but positioned myself to thrive. That was the truest form of striking back, not by becoming like them, but by becoming someone they could never control again. News of the court's decision spread quickly through our small town, and with it came the ripple effects Sophie and my parents had never believed would touch them. Sophie's counseling sessions were no longer optional. The judge ordered them to be completed in full, along with regular reports sent to CPS. Missing even one could mean mandatory additional intervention. The cheerleading squad officially replaced her as captain, citing the disruption of ongoing personal matters. For someone who had built her identity on being the golden girl, the blow was devastating. I heard from classmates that she had started avoiding the cafeteria at lunch, choosing instead to eat in the library, where fewer people would stare. My parents were also hit hard. The parenting classes they had to attend weren't the quick check-the-box kind they might have hoped for. They were intensive, focused on accountability and the long-term effects of neglect. Every session required participation, and reports from the instructors were sent directly to CPS. Around town, whispers began to follow them at the bank, where my father worked at the library, where my mother volunteered extra hours to avoid questions. They had built their social image on the idea of being an upstanding, enviable family. Now that image was fractured, and there was no way to fully repair it. At school, Sophie's old friends kept their distance, some out of discomfort, others out of self-preservation. A few of them reached out to me quietly, admitting they had seen things over the years but hadn't realized how bad it was. I didn't hold it against them. It wasn't their job to save me, and the truth was, I might not have believed them if the roles were reversed. What mattered was that Sophie could no longer hide behind the protective wall my parents had built for her. That wall had cracks now, and every day they widened a little more. One afternoon, while I was studying at Martha's kitchen table, an email came from the school counselor. She had forwarded a formal notice Sophie was being required to complete community service hours as part of her rehabilitation plan. The location: the local food bank where several of my teachers volunteered. I pictured her there, handing out boxes of canned goods under the watchful eyes of people who had once cheered for her on the football field. It wasn't revenge exactly, but it was accountability, and that was better. As for my parents, their attendance at every class and meeting was monitored closely. If they wanted even a chance of me coming home, which I didn't, they had to prove they could meet the basic standards of care they had failed to uphold for years. Watching from a safe distance, I realized that their downfall wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a slow, grinding erosion. Every privilege they had taken for granted was now tied to conditions they couldn't ignore. And Sophie, for all her defiance, was finally learning that actions had consequences. In the end, the price they paid wasn't just in reputation or inconvenience. It was in losing the control they had wielded over me for so long. That I knew was a loss they would feel every single day. The first morning I woke up at Martha's without feeling the familiar weight in my chest, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't that everything was perfect. My shoulder still ached on cold days, and the case with CPS was ongoing, but the constant tension that had once defined my every waking moment was gone. I could sit at the kitchen table and drink my tea without bracing for an argument. I could leave my books out without worrying they'd be accidentally damaged. I could breathe. That breathing room made space for something I hadn't dared to think about in years: who I was outside of my family's shadow. At school, I no longer felt like I was walking through hallways lined with tripwires. Teachers greeted me with warmth. Classmates who had never spoken to me before began offering genuine smiles, and the anxiety that had once gnawed at me in every interaction started to fade. I noticed that my voice sounded different, more steady when I answered questions in class. I found myself volunteering for group projects without the quiet fear that someone would undermine me. The scholarship offer became more than just a ticket out. It became proof that my hard work mattered, even if my family had tried to convince me otherwise. Martha encouraged me to celebrate the small wins. When I finished a tough assignment early, she took me out for coffee. When I was accepted into the university's summer prep program, she baked a cake. These gestures weren't grand, but they built a foundation under me that I had never had before, a sense that I was worth celebrating, not just for achievements, but for simply existing. Slowly, I started reclaiming parts of myself I had hidden away. I joined the debate team, something I'd avoided in the past, because I knew Sophie would mock me. I started running again, taking long loops around the neighborhood in the early morning, feeling my body grow stronger with each mile. The physical changes mirrored the internal ones. I no longer felt like I was always defending myself. Instead, I was building myself. The turning point came one afternoon when Mrs. Hill visited to give me an update on the case. She told me the judge was impressed by how well I was doing and that barring any major changes, I would remain with Martha until I turned 18. As she spoke, I realized I was smiling not because of what I was escaping, but because of what I was building. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was creating a life that belonged entirely to me. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote in my journal for the first time in years. I wrote about the blinding panic I'd felt the night of the chair incident, about the way my parents had looked right through me, and about the quiet, steady way my life had expanded since then. I wrote about the people who had shown up for me: Coach Reynolds, Mrs. Hanley, Mrs. Hill, and most of all, Martha, and how their belief in me had slowly reignited my belief in myself. By the time I put the pen down, I understood something I had never grasped before. My worth had never depended on my family's approval. It had always been mine to define, and now finally I was ready to live by that truth. 6 months after leaving my parents' house, I stood on the stage at our school's year-end ceremony, the auditorium filled with students, teachers, and community members. The applause washed over me as I accepted the award for Outstanding Student Achievement, the same stage where Sophie had once stood for her own accolades. My hands, which had been bruised and trembling on the night of the chair incident, now held the plaque steady. When I stepped up to the microphone, I didn't name names or recount the worst moments, but I spoke about perseverance, about the importance of speaking up even when it's uncomfortable, and about finding the strength to choose your own future when the path you're given is destructive. I told them success wasn't just about what you achieve, but what you overcome to get there. As I spoke, I caught sight of Martha in the front row, her eyes bright with pride, and further back I saw Mrs. Hill and Officer Davis, the people who had been there at the moment my life turned. After the ceremony, a few younger students approached me quietly. They told me they were dealing with problems at home and were thinking about asking for help. In their voices, I heard echoes of my own fear from months earlier, and I knew then that my story wasn't just my own anymore. It was a push for someone else to stand up. Later that summer, I moved into the university's Early Start program. The campus was alive with possibility, and every step I took across its green lawns felt like a step further from the cycle I had escaped. My parents sent a carefully worded email saying they wanted to rebuild our relationship, but I didn't reply. Forgiveness, I had learned, wasn't something I owed them, and healing didn't require their approval. Sophie was still completing her court-mandated counseling and community service. My parents were still attending classes they once would have laughed off. I didn't follow their progress closely because their lives were no longer my responsibility. What mattered was that the cycle had been broken for me, and that I was building a life where their control had no place. One evening, sitting in the quiet of the campus library, as the sun set outside, I thought about the night Sophie hit me with the chair. It had almost been the moment that ended me, but instead it became the moment that began everything else. I realized that the cold, the pain, the betrayal had all led to this sitting in a place they couldn't touch doing work. They couldn't diminish, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was. My life was mine now, and every choice I made from here on out would be deliberate, purposeful, and free. That was the real victory. Not revenge, not proving them wrong, but proving to myself that I could step out of the shadow and into the light and never look back.